Welcome back to Share the Load podcast. Today I'm talking to Josie Alexandra, who you can introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Josie. I'm an artist who wears many different types of artistic hats, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, Mia.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're here. You're sort of standalone person in this Unblocked series because we've worked together so closely and doing a lot more things than the other people in this series. So, but you also did the Unblocked class. So I think, I just by that I mean I'm a lot more familiar with like your beliefs around this stuff and how you practice both your art and consent and stuff like that. Uh, More familiar with how you do that than I have been with other people. So, yeah, hopefully that means that we can maybe get a little deeper into it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's start by I'm curious, I guess, how consent has made its way into your art practice.
I think consent starts with giving myself an affirmative yes, I'm going to take myself seriously as an artist.
Mm,
Um, yeah, like it it was a very pivotal moment of like walking across a city that I don't even live in and realizing that if I went off and studied something else, I would never have given myself the opportunity to know myself and opportunity to give what it means being an artist a go in my life. And I think beyond just having the confidence to say I'm an artist requires a lot of self consent. And then to maintain that self understanding requires practice. And to practice as an artist requires a level of discipline, self consent, self understanding, which is still an ongoing process of learning and execution in my own life. So I would say I'm still very much on the beginning journeys of a 2.5 year, 3 year journey of taking my art seriously, which required to take my healing and boundaries and consent practice more seriously as well.
yeah, that's amazing. That's um such a great way to put it. I'm curious, you said something in there about like living as an artist, and I wonder what that means to you to live as an artist.
I like to say these days that I'm unapologetically in flux because everything is changing, as you know, like because you work with me, that like I'm moving a lot, I'm trying to work out where to start a new life and everything like that. But I think, it comes down from, my father calling his children an artistic experiment to having the growing understanding of the way that being an artist is a service industry and that we're giving something to the community. I was listening to a podcast interviewing a musician the other week that said that you've recently said that in your work. And so that's like the shifting point that's happened recently in my life, is seeing the work that I'm doing as a service to world building. But I think prior to it, the last few years, I've seen practicing as an artist is something to do with taking the like the crises we're in and saying, what does it mean to examine these things? How can we envision and feel our way through this moment in time. And yeah, so I think there's a crossover of having a philosophical outlook, having a whole life. Like my dating feels like part of my artistic research. The things we do are in working in consent as part of artistic research. And yeah, it's just changing a lot at the moment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think about what you're saying around like, various aspects of your life being part of your artistic research. I think about that all the time, and there's a way that um there's some crossover with consent there in a few different ways. One is like it that makes it, first of all, the work that we do, the work that of making art, but also around consent. Like I work in consent. And so I see consent everywhere. Like I see it when I walk into someone's house and I see that it's a shoes off house and I don't want to take off my shoes, but I'm going to because that's what they want. Like I'm like, oh, there's consent at play. Like I can't really turn it off. And
Mm-hmm.
so it makes it really challenging to have any boundaries and to be able to have like a personal life that's separate from work, because my personal life is so charged with the same stuff that I'm thinking about for work. um and then that can lead to burnout. I mean, I wrote a scene for something I'm writing in bed trying to go to sleep the other night. Like it's just everywhere. And then the other thing about it is like then other people get involved in the work without giving their own permission. Like if my dating life is full of examples of boundaries and consent, and then those become sort of studies for me on like, how even they become examples for teaching, and they become examples for like something that furthers the work in some way. And it's like, but that person didn't necessarily agree. But like our life as artists, your life becomes the work. And it just, trying to navigate that, trying to figure out like, I'm dating someone right now and I'm like, I'm going to need to have a conversation with her sooner rather than later about like what is okay for me to even talk about. Like I didn't ask her if it was okay for me to even say that right now, and I'm like, okay, so like where is that line? I'm not using her name. Blah blah blah. But it's like, um, at what point do we have a conversation, and then how often do we have to like go back to that conversation to figure out like what's okay to talk about? Like, is it okay for me to talk about this but not this? Is it okay for me to even say like she's coming over later? Or can I talk about these things but not sex, or like sex but not these things? So I don't know, that's just something that's been on my mind a lot lately. um I'm writing a show right now that definitely involves, I'm writing a book where like one of the figures in it is an ex, and I'm like, do I have to ask his permission? I don't know. These are like sort of unanswerable questions in any kind of general way. It's going to be really specific to every person.
Completely. I think I'm very transparent with the people that I interact in life, that everyone that is within orbit is influencing me because
Right.
of that porousness. And
Yes.
I even wear like a ring on my engagement finger to say that my primary relationship is my arts practice. And that's always going to be something that people have to navigate and understand. And if it crosses their boundaries or it's something they're uncomfortable with, then being in orbit with me or being in alignment with me in life is obviously not the right move, and it's like their agency to take themselves out of relation with me.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I think a lot about is, you know, not telling other people's stories. And we've touched on this ourselves,
Yes.
but I don't have people's consent to tell their story, but I'm able to tell my story in how I was relating to them, or how
Yes.
my actions, everyone I was talking to my sister, and I was just hanging out with her like 6-year-old and 4-year-old, and they had tantrums and just acting like tired small children on the weekend. And I found it really draining and triggering. And then I texted her, and then I was like, underneath all of that desire to push away and say, oh my gosh, your children are too much when they're acting like 4-year-olds having tantrum because they've missed their bedtime, is actually something of grief of witnessing my sister allow her children to express their emotions without shame
Hmm.
and without punishment. And then witnessing her model a repair between the two of them, because I was like, the younger one was upset that the older one and an older friend didn't let her play with them. And then she had a tantrum, and then like later that evening my sister was modeling a repair and being like, what could you do in the future when you're like feeling left out? And I just like got home and I had to like lie down and rest. And then I was like, oh, it's so much being around small kids. And then it was just like, no, it's like a sense of almost not jealousy, but I don't have the right word, of like, what are these kids going to be like as adults that haven't
Mm-hmm.
been shut down? And I'm having to learn how to like give myself permission to feel frustration or rage or anger, and not close myself down and use it to fuel rest, to fuel creativity, to be able to like lie in bed at night and write a track even though
Mm-hmm.
I'm meant to be resting. But that's when the ideas come, like giving myself permission to feel what I need to feel at that time.
Yeah.
um so yeah, it's about forcing myself to look at what interactions are asking me to examine of
Mm.
myself.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really beautiful thing with kids to get to see. Like I just saw I'm just kind of dwelling on this video that I saw yesterday that was like this guy saying like one of the best things about having kids is that you get to be a kid again. You know, like, do you want to play Connect Four? Hell yeah. You know, like, do you want to play with Play-Doh? Oh my God, yes. You know, like all these things that are like you don't do as an adult. And I'm thinking also about the grief that I feel sometimes as an artist when I finally give myself permission to do something that I've wanted to do for so long. Um, and realizing like this is, and I think you and I have talked about this a little bit, but I've really felt that way about music a lot. Like when I put out my first EP, I just wept because I was like, I could have been doing this all along. And where would I be now? What kind of music would I be making now if I had let myself do this thing that I've wanted to do but thought was out of reach?
Mm,
Um, like I, I was so skilled technically as a, I don't even want to say as a musician, but like as a pianist, let's say, like as a kid, I was like classically trained. I was, really good at like the certificate of merit music theory tests. I was like placing in the, 95th percentile and all these things. And none of that made me feel like I was a musician, because if you sat me down on a piano and said, play something, I could play you Bach or Mozart, but I couldn't play you something of myself. I couldn't play, like, I couldn't write anything. I couldn't make something up. And it wasn't until the last few years that I learned to do that, that I let myself do that. Um, Even though like all through my life, I knew I wanted to write a musical. I knew I wanted to be in a band. I knew I wanted to sing. And I was like, oh, a parallel universe, like in another lifetime, I'll do that.
mm.
And then finally giving myself permission to do it. And not only like letting myself do it, but realizing like, hey, I'm pretty good at this, actually,
I'm so
and
excited to mix your album. Like,
I'm so excited for you to do that. And but I've had such immense like waves of grief, just being like, yeah, like this was in you all along, you know.
mm-hmm.
And it's so I'm learning to feel that grief and not try to make it shut up. But I think, kids really face you with this. Like they really show you this.
Yeah.
And not only like children, but like a person's children. Like I, as an adult, am still doing this to my own mother, who
Mm.
at 70, well, in retirement over the last 5 or 6 years, has finally allowed herself to study photography, which is what she wanted to study in high school and college, but her mom talked her out of it. So she went into print journalism. And then in the last several years, has learned how to use Photoshop, has taken all these photography classes, and she's incredible. She's very good. And she has gotten into 3 gallery shows across the country this year because she finally let herself. So I shared this with her because I got out of this meeting about a pilot that I'm writing, where the person was so kind and so encouraging and just was like, I have so much faith in your ability to do this. Like, you're so well equipped to do this. And I just cried when I got off the phone because I was like, I could have been doing this all along. And I did it, the only person who didn't believe in me was me. And I told my mom about this, and she was like, oh, sweetie, I'm feeling this now in my 70s. Like, you're still so young.
Yeah. I mean, that story brings almost tears to my eyes because it resonates with something that I talk about with, my auntie a lot, because she's having conversations to my nephew who's 8 and I'm 29 and she's in her late 60s, similar age.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like navigating all of these kind of things. And she's like, you're so lucky. Like she'll tell like my nephew, you're so lucky you're learning it at this age. I'm learning it 60 decades after you, kind of thing. And then like she'll constantly remind me as well of just like, you're so lucky you're doing it in your 20s. And
Yeah.
I think what that speaks to is actually when there's an intergenerational dialogue about consent and permission to, examine ourselves, because what the people around us are asking us to examine in ourselves. Because you can also get people of any age, but maybe it is a parent figure or a grandma figure or even just a peer who's like, no, but it's too late, or what do you mean by that, or still, I would call it, because this is how I call my own limiting beliefs, gaslighting myself.
Yeah.
And I think what this work does is allow for this beautiful ripple effect that does make change and let people find their artistic voice at any age, because art is timeless. And I think that is something really important to touch on, is the way of how people are receptive to that change. Because I don't think it's just children. Sometimes in like when this is unblocked podcast, like I can see in myself in my like late teenage years, early 20s, when I was very blocked, maybe not artistically, but blocked in the same way you were talking about technical skills with piano. It's like maybe I wasn't blocked artistically, technically, but spiritually and as a person blocked. I hadn't come to
Sure.
understand so much about myself. And I would see someone thriving that was my peer and recognize these days that the reaction that I was feeling towards their perceived freedom of self would have been, these days I understand it as jealousy, that they gave themselves permission to explore
Yes.
their creativity, their sexuality, their relationship styles, them walking away from friendships that no longer serve them, and all of these things that self-consent practices require us to do. And I was so jaded by it because I wasn't giving myself permission to do those things myself.
Right.
And yeah, I think now I just look back and I'm like, damn, they were doing it before me. Like, you know, like I wish I had the boldness to do that. And that's why I always have empathy when I feel like there's pushback by
Mm.
people around me, or I meet people with it, because I'm like, I've been there. And I think that's also like something unique, and I would say a gift is that we have the empathy to understand because we've been there. And I guess maybe what we see of people who've never had to go through this journey of self-consent, of self-acceptance, of giving ourselves permission to do something is a sense of entitlement and arrogance and judgment. You know, like I think it's very interesting to look at like what is the the behavior patterns of people who've never had to do this, and are they the people that actually hold space for
Mm.
us as artists? You know, I think it's the people, the artists that have supported me in transformative ways, whether it's little phone calls like yourself that says like, you know, you're going to be amazing at this, or like, you know, like someone's like, yeah, surely you're someone that like pulls a crowd of 50 people to a gig. And I'm like, I love that you say that, but like, let's be honest, it's two. Like, it's a live stream, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm glad, I'm so grateful that they like have that vision. They can see my vision or my potential and believe in it. And I think it's because they too have had to face whatever challenges in their own life to give themselves permission. And it's this uplifting of each other.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been reading Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act, and I so appreciate how he talks about like it's such a privilege to be able to pursue a creative path. Um, and that for some people, it's not right for them for whatever reason. And he's like, everyone is an artist, everyone can be an artist, but for some people, like that as their life is not the right choice. And for some people, supporting artists in other ways is part of their path. I think often of like I have a dear friend from kindergarten. I mean, we've known each other for almost 30 years. And she studied, I believe, like arts policy. And she works in the nonprofit sector. And, you know, I'm like, gosh, working in like an office setting, like a 9 to 5, or I think she's working like nine to seven, more like. And you know, like that is really not for me. And yet, you know, people like you and me need people to do those jobs, like to help us find the grants and to help us you know, and to organize that aspect of things and to create the policies that get artists funding and that get artists shown and and that create, you know, programs and education. Like that can be someone's calling. Like that can really be what someone's purpose is. And I think that's so beautiful because I think there's like a part of me that's kind of like, I just want everyone to be able to be creative and like make all their art, you know. And it's like, well, hang on a second, like that's your dream because that's what you want, but that's not actually what everyone wants. And thank goodness, you know.
Yeah. And I think also it doesn't allow for the fact that, like, you know, that skill set to create policy is an incredibly creative set of skills, you know?
Totally.
And
Yes.
like, I was in a lecture or like a presentation once with someone who was an environmental lawyer talking about rights of personhood for a river on this continent.
Wow.
And I was like, this just feels like an art theory lecture at university, you know?
Wow.
And I was like, law is, when it's being used in this future building way, is
Mm.
so creative and so I don't know, you're having to take all of these different ideas and marry them together and be able to articulate them in the same way that writing a musical or writing a song is, you know, you've got to be able to pair all these ideas together to present something. And I think you're right. Everyone is an artist, and it plays out in different ways, whether that's being a chef or a gardener, or even like the
Or a
precision.
parent.
Yes. And also like the precision of a dentist or a surgeon, like, you
Yes.
know, that's hand coordination. Like there's, I think the disservice that is in the Western Cartesian cultures that we find ourselves in is this split, you know,
Mm-hmm.
of like what is art and what isn't art, and rather see that like cultural production happens in so many different forms.
Yeah.
And we actually do ourselves a disservice when people say that they're not an artist because they don't know how to technically draw, you know.
Right. Right. You know, that's such a great point. And I a couple things came to mind. One is like my grandfather, who I have very conflicted feelings about, who died earlier this year. I remember one time, I mean, he did not value art at all. He did not value my artistic abilities. He did not see that as a reasonable life path for me, so on and so forth. But he worked a lot with tools, and he one time, I don't even remember what I was doing. I don't know if I was cutting onions for latkes or if I was like folding a piece of paper, but I remember him saying something like, wow, look at the dexterity that you have. He was like so impressed with my ability, my like really fine motor skills with my hands. And and most people listening know, I do ceramics, I play guitar, I play piano, I crochet. So like everything that I'm doing has like, immense fine motor skill requirements. Um, and I remember kind of being struck by that and thinking, and he, of course, because he was like, you get that from me. Like he was like, that runs in our family, it's genetic, you get that from me. And wherever it comes from, like, because that is my lived experience, it doesn't occur to me that other people don't have, like, some other people don't have that. So there's like a way that when someone can draw attention to something, like value gets placed on it, and then
Mm.
value got placed on it for me because this, and you were talking about like the intergenerational, the way that like that all kind of gets transmitted. um, so that came to mind. There was something else that you were saying. Oh yeah, when I was a kid, I said to my mom, um, and she remembers this. I said, I'm artistic, but I'm not an artist. So this is like kind of the opposite of what you're saying, where I was like, I have all these skills, but I'm not an artist. And this is like the same thing that I was saying earlier about like I was a skilled pianist, but I wasn't a musician. Like I had this idea in my mind that like I had all these skills, but I didn't really think like an artist. I didn't practice like an artist. I just was like technically skilled. I took drawing classes, I took painting classes, I took a jewelry making class. I could cook, I could write, I could play the piano, but an artist I was not. So I feel like it's been in my adult life that I've learned to kind of flip that, where I'm like, no, I'm an artist kind of no matter what medium I'm working in because I am an artist, and the skills will come
Mm-hmm.
through practice.
Yes. And they're there.
Right,
I mean,
right.
I think you've touched on something really interesting. And I think because instead of going off all philosophical, let's bring it back to what this podcast is about. And like maybe if you want to, we could open the conversation for how does unblocked facilitate that shift of
Ooh,
in your mind of like changes from being artistically skilled to being an artist, because otherwise we are very uncontained in a very dangerous tangential field of that question, you know?
Yeah,
Like
I
what
appreciate that. Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah,
what
let's go there, and then from there let's go to your perspective on grant writing as like self-exploration, and then let's
Mhm.
close out.
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, how do you think that, I mean, this is really interesting. I think I've mentioned this to you before that like people will tell me like, I want to do this with you because of your approach. And I'm always kind of like, cool, that's amazing. Can you tell me what my approach is? Because I'm just doing what I do. So like I really want to hear from you how you see that shift happen and how it's facilitated by the method that I've constructed and teach in Unblocked.
I think it brings it back to the practice of self-consent.
Okay.
And I think I can't really separate where I was in life to when I did Unblocked, because I was working on the closing few months of a very long research project that has accumulated into an 80-page manuscript of experimental poetry, my film, which you've seen, and like the workings of an album. And the film and the album is going to become a cinematic visual, what do you call it? A cinematic album. So I think I'm coming from the privileged place of being like, I already made that switch in 2020 of being like, I'm an artist, artistically skilled. I've gone to like reputable universities and done all of these things, but I didn't feel like an artist. And then I gave myself permission to being an artist. And I actually will answer maybe the second question about writing grants and writing grant applications a lot during 2020, 21, 22, because I was living in Melbourne, which had a 2-year long lockdown. And I was working with friends at the time to make audiovisual work, to make my own poetry, audiovisual work, and then spend a lot of time also writing grants and building the skill set of taking myself seriously as a full-time artist. So fast forward to when we were doing Unblocked in May 2020.
2023.
2023
This year.
was this year, 2023, was I'd kind of seen myself have a relapse because of things that had happened externally in my life. And when we met, you were like, everything you're describing sounds like you would benefit from doing Unblocked. And so I think what I see the value in Unblocked is you give people tools to able to even help themselves through relapses, because life is going to throw you challenges. Like you're going to have to deal with a family crisis, you're going to have to deal with a breakup, you're going to have to deal with global wars, like all of these things that are not going to stop happening once you decide to make that switch and consider yourself an artist and start going on that journey. And what comes to mind a lot is your care plans.
Yeah.
And also, I'm before even Unblocked, I'm a fan of the timers. And, I love using timers as also like a gauge of where my health, in March, but just before Unblocked, I couldn't even look at a computer screen for 5 minutes. I would turn the like timer on and I'm like, I'm just going to do 5 minutes and see where I go. And mind you, I could spend hours painting during March. So I think it's also like both of us have multiple creative outlets because they come at a certain point, and I see myself very seasonal in what needs to happen, because I think
Yes.
there's like my painting practice offers me something when I'm moving through trauma and disassociation. And yet the way that I paint is influenced and informs the way that I edit sound. And so I can see these
Beautiful.
direct layovers. And the other thing that I think you offer in Unblocked is the community space
Yes.
to be vulnerable with each other and talk in a safe container. And that, I think that was the most profound experience, is meeting people who could just say, I go through that too, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And
Well, and just to interject and add to that specific thing, people who you know are immensely talented and skilled and proficient and prolific, who are also dealing with extremely harsh inner critics and very intense imposter syndrome. And to look at other people, you know, to hear that you go through imposter syndrome can help me get over mine, because I'm like,
yes,
no, Josie, obviously you're so good at this and you are supposed to do this. Like, this is what you're supposed to be doing. Like, if you have imposter syndrome and it's stopping you from sharing this with the world, like, you know, then fuck that imposter syndrome. And then you turn that around on yourself and you just kind of go, oh,
yeah.
you know. But also, I feel like this is great because I have quoted you on this show before, and what you said stuck with me so much when you said, I don't have time for imposter syndrome.
Yeah. And I even wrote a track with the musician Princess Eve, who did all the production of it, and I wrote the lyrics about this exact
Great.
and it felt so good to just write a track that talks about imposter syndrome. And I've talked to my sister about that, who works in academia, so it's not it's like I think it is a feeling that transcends any industry, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
and and I think as artists, being able to write songs and musicals or whatever that actually teases apart this feeling and pulls it apart, rather than just being like, oh, I struggle with imposter syndrome, I've got to move on.
Yeah.
Like,
Get
I
over
think
it.
I think being an artist and giving myself time to meditate on what a feeling is and look at the ways that I can express it differently and write a song where I'm talking about imposter syndrome is external. It comes from the side eyes. It comes from the people that cut you off. It comes from the people who don't listen to you. It comes from the people that quote your work and your intellect without referencing you. It's all of these it's all of these external things, and it's a feeling in response to that. But I think
Yes.
it's not, well, until I started to unpack it myself, I hadn't really considered it as an issue that's external. I thought it
Yeah.
was something to do with me and who I was and my skill set or my experience level and all of these things. But it's like when you're in a room, like you're saying, that meeting that you started crying afterwards,
Yeah.
when you're in a room with someone who's not behaving in all of these subtle or overt ways, imposter
Mm.
syndrome doesn't exist. And
Right.
we're very, very confident, assured of ourselves, know that with practice our skills grow. um
Yeah. I love what you're saying there, and I really appreciate the distinction that imposter syndrome is a reaction to the outside world. I think that's also true of our inner critic usually.
mm-hmm.
And when we don't examine where our inner critic comes from, um, something really cute is happening. My dog just came running out of my bedroom to go like sniff my cat who's asleep in the sun on a chair over there. And now it's very sweet. Um, One of the practices, or I'll talk about two of the practices that we do in Unblocked. One is that I ask, where does your confidence come from? And where does your inner critic come from? and I ask it in that order with great intention. I think what can happen when you don't look for where your inner critic came from is that you just think it's you. You just
Mm-hmm.
think this is true. This is a voice in my head that is giving me the hard truth that no one will say to my face. And if I can just harness it to make me keep going, then it'll be, it'll be doing its job. When really your inner critic came from, like mine is often like things my mom said to me growing up, things that my dad said about other people when I was growing up. Think, that one scene in that one movie where someone got trashed, like from She's All That,
Yeah.
like it's from ads that I saw that told me that my body hair was disgusting. It's from the kids in, like, that one kid who sat behind me in psych class who like blew on my arm hair from behind me and made me self-conscious. Like that is where my inner critic is a combination of all of these outside voices and experiences that has that just still haunt me. And if I
Mm-hmm.
can look at where it comes from and I can understand whose voices it is, whose voices it's made up of, then I can recognize that none of it is coming from within me.
Yes.
That's one thing. And then we look at imposter syndrome and ask this big question, which is like, do you have imposter syndrome because you're doing something that has never been done before?
Oh, I love that. I can remember, you know, really having to sit with that. And I actually think I was feeling that last night, a bit of imposter syndrome and inner critic playing out because I was sitting in an audience full of people at a film festival last night and the film was screening, and as soon as my film Compass in Hand came on, I was like, oh, and it's so different to all the other films. It's an experimental film. I have a background in fine art. I don't, I went on a date in May or April with someone who works in the film industry. And I was talking about my project, and he goes, "So you're the director?" And I'd
Mm,
never considered myself the director because I'm like, I'm just the lead artist. I'm running this project. I'm the musician, blah, 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 blah. And then I
mm-hmm,
was like, okay, cool. I'm talking like, and then I'm like, having to quieten it because it's just like those feelings. I was like, this work, I know I'm so proud of. And I think
mm-hmm,
that's like when we're giving ourselves permission to practice and create. And the distinction for me came was in 2019. I was like, I'm fucking sick of making work I'm not proud of.
mm,
I don't care what, it doesn't do anything if people like it or don't like it. I want to myself be very proud of myself. And this film is the direct result of that.
mm,
And I've I was watching it and I was noticing all these feelings come up, and I had to be like, look, you've just had an argument with your parents like last night. You're going to be feeling like a bit like, I had to just calm myself and be like, I'm really proud of this. And you're now in a room full of people watching it. And the organizer of the film festival was like, as soon as I saw it, I knew it had to be included. And then the award ceremony comes through, and like Jolie, who did the cinematography for some of the scenes, won best cinematographer, and I'm like, so I'm conceived, produced, made an award-winning film in multiple film festivals now.
mm-hmm.
And I had to pause then, and I was just like, my inner critic was just like, yeah, but they're not big festivals. And I'm like, so
Mm,
these things are so ever present. And I think it's about, I think Unblocked really gives permission to say, you can't just get a knife and cut these things out of you. You know,
that's
it's
beautiful.
not, both of us practice what it means to be non-binary in what I would consider a philosophical sense. We
Yes,
approach our way that we think about the world, about how we interact with consent and creativity from a trans perspective. And I think
yes,
that's also something that you bring to unblocked or your approach to work is I call it the architecture of thought is non-binary. And
Yes.
and I think it means that I can just acknowledge that then of just saying, hey, like my film just won an award last night. But at the same time, I have this little inner critic say this. And I think the more that we externalize those little things of being like, hey, I just noticed this silly little inner critic thing,
Mm-hmm.
it's like we're not shaming ourselves anymore. And I'm not pretending or masking as someone who's fully healed from having imposter syndrome or fully healed from having inner critics, because I think they are going to be present for
Yeah.
life, you know.
Yes.
And I think
I,
it's more about our relationship to these things.
yes. I think there's a term in consent education called noticing. And noticing in this context is exactly what you are talking about, which is to observe without judgment. So to observe your inner critic without having it mean that you aren't healed or that you are still an amateur or that you shouldn't be feeling that way or that um you have to get over it, but just to go, oh hey, that's there.
Mm.
There you are. I had there's a few coyotes in my neighborhood, and I was looking up like, how do I deal with a coyote? And it was like, get a flashlight and a whistle and this citronella spray. And I was like, so I go out of my house to walk my dog with like a whistle and a flashlight and a this and a this, and I'm like so tense, and I'm like looking around for this coyote. The other night I heard this couple walking their dogs just go, hi coyote, nice to see you, and like keep walking. And I was like, whoa, like that's such a different way to like move through the world, like I'm like ready for battle and I need all my gear. And these two are just sort of like, I'm just gonna like acknowledge you as an equal and I'm not gonna show you that I'm afraid. And then we can coexist peacefully. Like it was quite a wake-up call. Um, but also something that you said in there made me think of something that I don't remember. But I really want to give you a chance to share with everybody like how you approach grants, because I think that what you're taught what like you have helped me so much with grants, and you've helped me learn about my own work through the grant writing process. So I was hoping that you could kind of leave everybody with a little bit of that.
I would love to. I would just say that like grant, whether it's a grant application for funding, whether it's an exhibition, what do you call it, expression of interest, or an application for a development program, for example, I think it's important to distinguish that these kind of applications are often very similar, but also they're asking different things from us as artists.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but at the core of it is an opportunity to write ourselves into the future. And that is what I say, it is like a love letter to myself. And that's the way I I don't I take it seriously that like I spent a good portion of 2020 and 2021 in lockdown writing applications, either for my own ideas and my own practices or collaboratively on two different projects that never see the light of day. But I think, and I have to quiet my inner critic again of saying, where is this huge chunk of productivity that
Mm-hmm.
the audiences, but actually what you do see of that compass in hand, is the result of working on a lot of projects that never actually got finished. Relationships deteriorated. They didn't we didn't consent to them being shown to the world. But in that process of writing grants as a love letter to ourselves, I think a lot of my thinking has very much been influenced to Isabel Anderson, who runs Female DIY Musician out of the UK. And I really love the way that she marries psychology mind shift to creative practice as well, and whether she is or not calling it self-consent practices, she has a lot of crossovers kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I just was like, you can go to therapy and someone says, write a letter to your 10-year-old self doing whatever, like those kind of activities that psychologists give us to do to accept the past. Well, I kind of just flipped that on its head, and I was like, writing grants is a way of saying I want to exist in the future in this way, and that's the core of it. And I think there's also this great idea that rejection is redirection. So you get rejected from, and I'm not going to say it doesn't hurt. Sometimes, like a few weeks ago, I looked at my emails at the wrong time. I was very tired. I was not expecting to get 2 rejections that night, and I did cry. And what it showed me was I want to go to London. So I'm moving to London,
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm not saying that rejection doesn't hurt, but I think if I've applied for 2 or 3 years now to go to residencies and do masters in London, there's something in London that my practice is asking of me. So yeah, that's like, I think that's really important, because it's not like I'm a non-feeling robot that can just put in all of this time and effort into grants, which do take a lot of time. But what I'm saying is they're an opportunity to include in part of the creative process. And so maybe it does take me 2.5 years to produce a film. But in that time, what I'm so proud of is I had funding to pay everyone on set. I paid my nephew, who's 8, and he was like, you don't need to pay me. And I'm like, I want to pay you so you know that your labor is worth it.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And I got to go on all these residencies. I got to meet people who have informed my practice because of it. And I had the time to set the intention of how I wanted my shoots to feel. And I've had people tell me afterwards and reflect back into it of being like, that was the calmest film shoot they'd ever been on. And when I fed them, and it was a skeleton crew, I mean, there was like 6 of us in the shoot, like it was a very small shoot, and I had them being like, the people who work as like stylists or shoot photographers, filmmakers, being like, we didn't expect to get fed because it's so small. If it's a small shoot like this, we weren't expecting to get fed. And I was like, well, I put funding aside in my grant to feed you, because like you're on set from like 7 a.m. till 6 p.m. or something like that. And so I think not only is grant writing a love letter to the future, or like the future in kind of artist or lead artist that's bringing together a whole team to make something happen, because if you don't have the team, my work wouldn't be what it is without the team, but then I think it extends further into that of like, how do you want to treat your team? What kind of relationships? And then again, consent comes into it. Is like, do you want to show care, or do you want to show exploitation? Do you want to show that you value them and you think about all of their needs, like being fed? Or do you want to say, oh, it's just, we love this, we've got to do this, there's not enough money in the world, so we're just going to have to make this off the back of each other, like working a full-time job, like you and I both get frustrated at this philosophy, because it's like, okay, cool, I took 3 years, and I would say probably a year of that, well, actually I wasn't working on these ideas in 2020 and 2021, but I'd been building the skill set. So by November 2021, when I applied for the grants to work on this project, I'd done 2 years of skill development in writing applications and in conceiving of how I talk about my practice and in conceiving of all of these things. So by the time I came to apply for a grant for this project, I got it. But there was a lot of rejection prior to that. And then I kept on applying for more funding to be able to pay everyone involved. Or like there was a bit of like artistic trade as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to acknowledge that it wasn't all paid for, but it was labor was matched.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What was I saying?
Well, we were talking about grants, but I mean, I think you hit everything that I had asked.
Yeah.
And speaking of care for self, I am noticing that I need to take a nap.
Yeah. Well, it's your evening over there.
Can you see? I know I am like wilting before your eyes. Um, Plus, I mean, we've been talking for a long time. This was a really great conversation. The time flew by.
Yeah, that happens with
Um,
us.
yes. Can you tell everybody where they can find you and how they can pay you and what they can hire you for?
Yeah, for sure. So the probably easiest way to contact me is through my Instagram or my email. And my Instagram is IEA Studios, which is AEAEA_studios, STUDIOUS, I think.
Yes.
And then my website is again the same name, but it has the URL, the IEA Institute. But maybe you could put it in show notes or just like
Yes, for
something
sure.
like that. And on there, I'm offering workshop facilitations, which go into my artistic methodology, which we kind of touched on, but the grant writing is just one of the methodologies. I have a few other that I've developed over the last 3 years as, methodologies to support neurodiverse and trans ways of being as artists, because I don't think those ways of being are fully accepted within mainstream funding,
Mm-hmm.
So it's about that. So those kind of workshops. I offer like creative consultancy or creative producing, and that I use those two different things because like consultancy could just be me reading over a script and saying like, are you sure you want to end your film this way? I'm seeing this narrative be reproduced by
Mm.
ending it this way. What kind of impact or story are you trying to have by ending it a possibly different way? So that's where I'd say like that's consultancy. Or even like the way that I've been working with you is like, how do you see your whole practice? Where do you want to be going?
Yeah.
And then creative producing, I'm much more selective on it, and it's more, how can I work with you to take a project from beginning, middle, end, and really share all of the skills that I've learned from writing a grant,
Uh-oh.
producing a project.
Wait, you froze for a second. You said creative producing what?
I'm more selective in it because I want to be working with projects I really, really believe in. So that
Mm.
would require relationship building over time to deliver a
Yeah.
project from, wherever someone is and take it to delivering it to audiences. And that's a durational, someone could just have a 2-hour call with me and I throw out a lot of ideas, and that's consultancy. Whereas producing
Mm-hmm.
is really, giving more of my emotional, spiritual
Totally.
labor to believing in a project and wanting it to succeed. And
Yes.
yeah, they're the main like ways that I'm working with other people. I'm also like starting to do some mixing for you, and I'm going to see how
Mm-hmm.
that goes. That's audio mixing. And yeah, just I would say if anyone needs help with poetry, filmmaking, or audiovisual making, scripts, and just conceptualizing how they're an artist and being able to communicate that
Yeah.
is what brings me passion when I'm working with other people.
I can attest that you are very skilled at that, and it has really changed how I conceive of my own work. I think it's been a really very positive experience for me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Likewise.
All right, Josie, thank you so much for doing this. I'm
Thank
sure
you.
I'll be seeing you next week, probably sometime.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Ciao. Bye.